He once stated 4 words that should terrify anyone who believes in a fair market. Competition is a sin. And John D. Rockefeller meant it. John D. Rockefeller Sr. built his empire by constructing a terrifying, illegal oil monopoly that suffocated independent businesses across the country. And the contradictions run much deeper. The exact same foundation currently saving lives around the world spent the 1930s aggressively funding the American Eugenics Record Office. The money directly inspired the racial hygiene laws later adopted by Nazi Germany. We are conditioned to categorize historical figures cleanly as villains or heroes. You cannot do that here. America's greatest humanitarian triumphs and its darkest ethical failures were compiled from the exact same source code. In the 1850s, the Pennsylvania oil boom was a chaotic gamble. Wells dried up overnight, and oil prices swung wildly. Rockefeller watched the frenzy from afar. He hated uncertainty. Instead of joining the mob and gambling on where the oil might be hidden underground, he chose to focus strictly on controlling what happened to the oil once it came out. Instead of drilling for crude oil, he purchased the refineries required to process it. He realized that to conquer a highly volatile, unpredictable industry, you don't play the same game as everyone else. You seize the choke points, lock down the infrastructure, and dictate the terms. His first strategic move was to ignore drilling entirely and pour his resources into the refining process, the mandatory step where raw crude oil is boiled down into usable kerosene. While his competitors treated refining as a blunt, messy process, Rockefeller applied his obsessive accounting to the chemistry. When crude oil is refined, it creates waste. Rockefeller took that waste and sold it. He sold paraffin to candle makers, petroleum jelly to medical companies, and chemical sludge to pave public roads. By ensuring absolutely nothing was discarded, he extracted maximum monetary value from every single molecule of crude oil that entered his facilities. This generated a profit margin his rivals simply couldn't touch. This extreme efficiency provided him with a massive, untouchable financial war chest, which he then weaponized to systematically destroy the competition. Rockefeller paid less for his own train cars and literally pocketed the extra fees overcharged to competitors. If a rival managed to survive the transit squeeze and still refused to sell, Rockefeller escalated to physical siege tactics. He would buy up the entire regional supply of the barrels and chemicals needed for the refining process, bringing rival factories to a complete standstill. He would intentionally slash his own prices so low that he operated at a massive loss, comfortably burning his own cash until his competitors ran out of theirs. Once they declared bankruptcy, he swept in and bought their assets for pennies on the dollar. Rockefeller wasn't participating in a free market. He was running a militaristic campaign to conquer it. By the 1880s, the public viewed his company Standard Oil as an octopus strangling the country. He controlled 90% of the oil in the United States. This document is a Standard Oil Trust Certificate, representing a terrifying concentration of capital. Eventually, the United States government had to intervene. After years of investigations and congressional hearings, the Supreme Court handed down a historic ruling in 1911, officially dismantling the Standard Oil monopoly for severe antitrust violations. Standard Oil was shattered into 34 separate entities. These newly formed pieces would eventually become the modern corporate titans we know today, including Exxon, Chevron, and the American branch of BP. Rockefeller should have been ruined, but there was a mechanical reality. Because he was the primary shareholder, the courts granted him equivalent shares in every single one of the 34 newly formed entities. Free from restrictions, these 34 companies grew entirely unchecked globally. Because he owned a piece of all of them, his net worth multiplied exponentially. The supreme law of the land, designed specifically to punish his ruthless business practices, served as the exact catalyst that made him the wealthiest man in human history. Yet his monopoly produced a complex reality. By forcing ruthless standardization onto a chaotic industry, he drove consumer prices down. He made kerosene light affordable for the working class, and eventually produced gasoline cheaply enough to fuel the entire automobile revolution. To understand how he reconciled this predatory behavior, you have to look at his faith. Rockefeller was a deeply devout Baptist. He sincerely believed his capacity to extract and hoard this immense wealth was a divine gift, given to him explicitly so he could manage it for the betterment of mankind. He gave away $500 million during his lifetime. He entirely funded the creation of the University of Chicago. He built America's first major biomedical research center, funding scientists who would go on to win 24 Nobel Prizes. For Rockefeller, monopoly and charity never conflicted. Crushing his competitors served a necessary, ruthless purpose. It allowed him to aggregate the massive capital required to save humanity. That vast capital mobilized the early Rockefeller Foundation on a global scale. They successfully eradicated hookworm across the American South. They funded the researchers who developed the vaccine for yellow fever, preventing millions of deaths. They directed heavy funding into agricultural science, spearheading what we now call the Green Revolution. Their development of high-yield crops actively prevented mass starvation in developing nations. However, this absolute faith in scientific progress carried a terrifying cost. The foundation believed that if science could eradicate a virus, it could also engineer a flawless human population. They pumped heavy funding into the American eugenics movement, financing institutions like the Eugenics Record Office. That money soon crossed the Atlantic. By 1926, the foundation was sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. They continued writing checks well into the 1930s, supporting researchers whose work provided the intellectual framework for the Third Reich. In Guatemala and Puerto Rico, doctors operating with Rockefeller funding treated vulnerable populations as biological test subjects. They deliberately infected patients with syphilis and injected them with cancer cells without their consent, justifying the abuse as medical advancement. The foundation's greatest historical triumphs and its most unforgivable atrocities stem from the exact same institutional hubris, the belief that with enough capital and enough science, you can forcibly engineer a perfect world. The modern Rockefeller Foundation is actively attempting to cleanse this historical ledger. Recently, they pledged to completely divest their $6 billion endowment from the fossil fuels that originally built it. In 2021, the foundation's president, Rajiv Shah, explicitly condemned the organization's eugenics history. He publicly admitted the institution had to confront the uncomfortable truths of the policies they historically perpetuated. Which brings us back to that massive Christmas tree in Manhattan. If you strip away the corporate glamour, the true historical origin of this symbol reveals the reality of the empire. A billionaire did not erect the first tree. In 1931, a group of Italian, Greek, and Irish immigrant construction workers pooled their sparse Depression-era wages to buy a 20-foot balsam fir. They decorated it with paper garlands and tin cans. Compare that humble fir to the monolith that stands there today, topped with a 900-pound Swarovski star featuring 3 million individual crystals. The capital of the empire eventually absorbed the workers' quiet symbol of resilience. You cannot cleanly separate the good Rockefeller from the bad. The cheap energy lighting the world, the medicine that saves lives, and holiday symbols we gather around are inextricably bound to ruthless monopoly and deep ethical compromise.